I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
Donald Trump is officially the Republican Party's presidential nominee. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Republican National Convention wrapped up on Thursday night with former U.S. President Donald Trump clinching his spot on this year's Republican presidential ticket. The gathering was particularly emotional following last week's assassination attempt on Trump. As Owen Fairclough reports, the convention was a life-changing event for many delegates.
All U.S. presidential elections are dramatic, including the conventions, of which plenty have gone to the wire, choosing between rival candidates. But this Republican convention is arguably transformative because delegates have a candidate who's completely reshaped the party in his image and arrived here after escaping assassination.
I stand before you in this arena only by the grace of Almighty God.
The image of Trump's defiance moments after a bullet clipped his ear is already on Republican merchandise.
And we must not criminalize dissent or demonize political disagreement, which is what's been happening in our country lately at a level that nobody has ever seen before.
Many of the delegates we've spoken to this week have noticeably avoided referencing the furore over President Joe Biden's age and fitness for office. And that's been reflected by some of the biggest hitters to appear on this convention floor.
Joe Biden screwed up, and my community paid the price.
Trump's running mate, Senator JD Vance, targeted Biden, but only on policy.
From the financial crisis to the Great Recession, from open borders to stagnating wages, the people who govern this country have failed and failed again.
If this convention was intended to display unity and inclusivity, some delegates didn't agree with the script.
I don't welcome everybody in this meeting. In this room, the guys up in the fake news, frankly, you guys up there in the fake news have worn out your welcome.
U.S. Senate candidate Kari Lake's rhetoric similar in tone to the way Biden and Trump were talking about each other in the run-up to this convention.
The worst, most incompetent, most corrupt president in history.
Donald Trump is a convicted criminal.
His son is a convicted felon.
You're the sucker. You're the loser.
But if this week in Milwaukee marked something of a truce in one of the bitterest presidential election cycles in memory, for many, it was the culmination of the Republican Party's transformation.
We are not beholden to anyone or any party.
Whose base has shifted so much, a trade union leader addressed a Republican convention for the first time in its history. Trump personally shaped pledges for a second presidency that relegated an issue as sacrosanct as the federal ban on abortion from his list of priorities. But that doesn't appear to be a deterrent.
Look around. I think we're already pulled together. And I think the differences on some of the, different policies and things, I think has been put aside, and then we are all together, and it's a beautiful thing.
We're more of a party for the people and also for workers, for the common Americans and not for the elites.
As delegates leave this convention considering how it will shape the rest of the presidential election, as well as the potential Donald Trump presidency, the contrast with Democrats could not be more striking as they prepare for their convention in a month's time, engulfed in crisis over their candidate. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Milwaukee.
Okay, to discuss the convention and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Miami, Jadan Horyn is a political analyst. From Maryland, we're joined by Joel Rubin. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for House Affairs. Also from Maryland, Joseph Williams is a former Senior Editor at U.S. News and World Report. And joining us from Delaware, Brice is Secretary of the Delaware Republican Party, former host of the podcast The Brice is Right, and a conservative columnist. Welcome to all of you. Brandon, the Republican convention is now over. Former President Donald Trump, as well as JD Vance, are now the formal nominees. As our reporter told us, it was an event overshadowed to some extent by the assassination attempt on Trump just days before the convention started. So how do you see it? What's your assessment of what took place in Milwaukee over the past week?
This was one of the most amazing conventions that I've been to, because this was very different. I almost had dreams of watching WWE, and oh, by the way, Hulk Hogan happened to be there to speak on Donald Trump's behalf. You know, what it did is, coming off of the assassination attempt, and let's be clear, no president should ever have to experience that. But what it did is it almost made Donald Trump almost like some kind of martyr, where now he's got the sympathy vote, the vote that he didn't expect to get. He's now got that vote. And I think what the deal, if you looked at the convention, it was a play of what Republicans, the old country club Republicans, those Republicans that, you know, were your CEOs. You really didn't have that environment last week. This week, it was really down home voters. It was, you know, especially when you look at JD Vance's mother, the Appalachian focus. This convention was about low-income white male voters. That's who they targeted. And, you know, the opportunity with that is that typically is not the group that you would think of when you think of a Republican Party. And so this was monumental when you look at the fact that, you know, people like Dana White, you know, and when people like, you know, when you think about UFC, their founder, their president supporting Donald. When you think of Kid Rock, who comes from my state, Michigan, they were speaking to a language, and I think that's why the president picked JD Vance coming out of Ohio, because he's saying to Middle America, we finally hear you and we support you. And I think if the Democrats are not careful, this could have a big impact come November.
All right, let me pick up on that with Jadan Horyn. Jadan, JD Vance was not always a fan of Donald Trump. In fact, some of his past criticism of the former president has been pretty scathing. There is a great deal of discussion, as we just heard from Brandon, about what JD Vance brings to the ticket. Here's one opinion. This is Rodney Mutterspool, who is the former police chief and a former council member of the town where JD Vance comes from. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I think JD has the pulse of a lot of small-town America. Regardless of what people say, I think he does. And I think the president knows that's how you're going to win the election, number one.
So is that what JD Vance is going to do, deliver small-town America for President Trump?
President Trump doesn't need JD Vance to deliver small-town America. President Trump, in both the 2016 election and the 2020 election, won rural areas by over 20 points. No, what I think JD Vance actually brings to the ticket is an idea of an heir. Whether he is the correct heir or not for the MAGA movement and for the Republican Party, but he brings someone who background, it has a compelling story, but also contacts with mega donors and Silicon Valley elite. And truly, I think that's actually what he brings. And that was the calculus, cynically, for why he was chosen.
Yeah, but what does he bring in terms of votes?
Well, nothing. I mean, most vice presidents actually don't bring anything in terms of votes. We know that Gore did not bring anything in terms of votes for President Clinton, who was already a Southerner. Certainly, Cheney did not bring anything in terms of votes with Wyoming for George W. Bush. Tim Kaine didn't bring anything in votes in terms of Virginia for Hillary Clinton. So again, it's about shoring up a particular class of people, and it's not his growing up bio of being a country person. It's more his elite bio of being a venture capitalist, Silicon Valley connected elite. And that is what Trump wanted to bring in. And I think we saw from the assassination attempt to the end of the RNC, a movement of those Silicon Valley types into the Republican fold.
Joel Rubin, of course, JD Vance was one of the key speakers at the convention in Milwaukee. And this is how Vice President Kamala Harris, this is what she had to say about Vance's acceptance speech at the convention. Let's listen to her.
He did not talk about Project 2025, their 900-page blueprint for a second Trump term. He did not talk about it because their plans are extreme and they are divisive. In recent days, they've been trying to portray themselves as the party of unity. But here's the thing. If you claim to stand for unity, you need to do more than just use the word.
So, Joel, do you agree with what the Vice President was saying there about the Vance speech, and by extension, former President Donald Trump?
Well, and it's clear that this is why JD Vance doesn't want to debate Kamala Harris, because she will bring up everything that he tried to hide and avoid saying the other night. You know, I didn't know who that JD Vance was. I was watching that speech trying to figure it out. Is he the old JD Vance that said Donald Trump is an American Hitler? Or is he the new JD Vance that says he wants a national abortion ban and wanted to overturn the 2020 election? It was neither. The flat Vance. Basically, they air dried him. They puffed him up with some makeup. And as Jadan says, he's got Peter Thiel's money backing him. He's a venture capitalist, Yale attorney, and that's what Donald Trump wants. And he has fealty now. This was more of a coronation of Donald Trump rather than the nomination, a very unique spectacle in the history of American democracy. And I think JD Vance just helps support that coronation and that kingship of King Donald.
Joseph Williams, Trump appears to have built quite a diverse coalition. I mean, if we look at the people who support him, urban white voters, rural voters, Latino voters, and black voters. I mean, here is one of the black delegates at the convention talking about Trump's popularity among black voters. Let's listen.
Well, African-American men have been very vocal about their support for Trump. I think he laid a very good foundation for that during his 45 term, how he reached out and how he basically used the presidential platform to enact policies that directly affect black men. And one of those policies, of course, was the Second Chance Act.
Joseph, to be clear, of course, Joe Biden still has the overwhelming support of black voters. It's almost by a ratio of 2 to 1. But what do you make of the fact that Trump is getting growing support among black voters, among Latino voters as well, generally among people of color, given that he's been accused so many times of being a racist?
Well, I think there are two things going on, and I'll precede that by saying if this was a convention that was reaching out to white men, certainly black men might not have gotten the memo, at least not just yet. But I think there are two things going on. The first is that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party. There has been over years that they don't have the kind of sweeping LBJ, War on Poverty, Civil Rights Act. That hasn't happened in Black America under Democratic administrations, and it really can't. For many reasons, not the least of which is that Congress controls a lot of the action and the president's not imperial. So I think there's a lot of frustration that there have not been programs explicitly targeted at the black community, and so people are feeling frustrated and left behind. Now, the record may show differently, but the sense is that that's not happening. The second thing that I think is going on is that I think this movement of black voters and black male voters to the Republican Party, I think it might be a little bit overblown right now. I mean, let's keep in mind that we're still a good 3 months out from the election, and we heard the same narrative in Georgia, where a lot of black men were going to vote for Brian Kemp instead of Stacey Abrams. Now, while there was a significant amount or a fair amount, a reasonable amount of black male support for Kemp, it wasn't as wholesale as a lot of people were predicting. And rather than vote for Kemp, a lot of black men either stayed home or voted for Stacey Abrams. And in an election, the national election, where things are going to be decided at the margins, any push in one direction or the other with any significant group can make a huge difference. But I do know that Joe Biden has been trying to shore up the black vote over the last couple of months. He's trying to convince black voters that he has their interest at heart and that Donald Trump does not. And I also think that one last final point is that there's a lot of nostalgia about the Trump economy, that it was good for Black America, and that the Second Chance Act was the sweeping proposal that helped a lot of people. Now, the Second Chance Act, give him his due, it did help some people, but it wasn't the kind of positive program, it wasn't the kind of sweeping change that Black America is hungry for. So I think nostalgia combined with some misdirected polls and some time left before the election gives the illusion that there's a significant black push for Donald Trump.
Joel, I'm going to turn away from the Republican convention now and look at what's going on in the Democratic Party, there's increasing speculation.
Oh, boy.
And yes, right. You know what that speculation is, that President Biden will be withdrawing his candidacy for president. But that was yesterday. Today, Friday, he sent a letter, an email saying, quote, "We will defeat him. I look forward to getting back on the campaign trail next week." I mean, we've heard all these Democratic Party leaders saying you need to step aside. So what is going on?
I think the president says he's staying in because he means it. Look, we have 35 members of Congress that have called for him to step aside, and that's not an insignificant number, but there's well over 200 senators and members of Congress that are saying stay in. And what's really important, I think this needs to be understood, is that the base of the Democratic Party, the voters, the actual people who count on Election Day, they want him to stay in. The progressive leaders, Hispanic caucus leaders, CBC, the Black Caucus, the unions, the small dollar donors have been consistently strong since the last several weeks. They all want him to stay in. And I think he hears that, and he looks at what happened last night. He says, well, Donald Trump might have shored up his base, but that's his 45%, and he's not growing it. That convention last night did not expand, did not go to independents. There is no, with all due respect, there's no sympathy to garner. He didn't obtain it. And one last thing, he also said, deport them all. I mean, how is that going to work with Latino and immigrant communities? So I think Joe Biden, he looks around, he sees the numbers, he sees Trump, he sees the base support, and he says, I still got a pathway here, and I'm going to stay in.
Brandon, this speculation in the Democratic Party on Biden's candidacy, well, when you look at it from the Republican side, we've heard many commentators say, well, look, the Republicans would like Biden to stay in because they believe that Trump can very easily defeat him. If he pulls out, what does that mean for the Republican campaign?
First of all, I don't know what they're drinking in Maryland, but my folks in the Democrat Party, they want him gone. And, you know, I think it's a shame when your own political party has basically called for your resignation because they see the writing on the wall. The other thing is, you know, you spoke about Kamala Harris earlier.
Yeah.
I find it interesting. She's the vice president. According to the Constitution, she's the person that would take over if anything happened to the president, and no one's talking about her. They're talking about everybody else but Kamala Harris. And so that tells me a lot about her leadership. The reality is, I think, if I had to guess, I think Joe Biden will probably announce that he will not seek re-election. But I don't see Joe Biden stepping down at a time like this, when there are still some who believe that he can still be successful in November. I don't think so, but we'll see.
Okay, Joel, do you want to respond to what Brandon said there?
Oh, look, I mean, I can't disagree with what he said. I do think it's disappointing that people, when they're calling for the president to step aside, don't automatically go to the vice president, who is the one on the ticket, who has the legal right to control the resources that they raised, and the 14 million voters who voted for them in the primary, she was voted for as well. What we're talking about here, though, is a bunch of polls and concern about the polls that it's 3.5 months out from an election. President Biden has a strong record. He won the primary. He has the apparatus in place. And I think, yes, certainly there are people who are concerned, and they have a reason to be concerned. Why not? This should be a bigger gap in this election. But I don't think that the president has any intention of stepping down. And I think that that's just, we're going to see the party coalesce sooner rather than later. But there's still some drips happening in this meantime, and there will be a few more probably. But this is where the president's head is, and I think this is the right place to be.
Jaden, talking about polls, there was one that was on CNN earlier this week, which showed that Trump would get up to 330 of the electors, well over the 270 needed to become president in the election. Looking at what's going on in the Democratic Party, is there anything that would change that? Could you see the Democrats choose someone who could change those numbers?
I think it's too much of a hypothetical. From what we can see from the snap polling that's been done, President Trump fares equal or better against a hypothetical match with Vice President Harris. But more crucially, I would say, is that these hypothetical tickets present what would be unvetted candidates to the national stage. And while we could take snap polls now that theoretically show that a Harris-Shapiro ticket or a Harris-Whitmer ticket could do better theoretically, what we do know is that these candidates, those particular governors, haven't been vetted nationally in the same way that both Biden and Harris, who, I have to say are the most vote-winning Democratic ticket in history, have been vetted on a national level. And the unknown unknowns are truly actually much more dangerous to Democrats than I think continuing a path with these current nominees. What it could truly present is a scenario of complete wipeout if they choose someone who has a damaging background that is revealed by either Republicans or Democrats that do not want or like that candidate. And that's something that if I were the Democratic Party, I would not even begin to try to do at this point. I do have to say, though, a President Harris at the top of the ticket, I think Republicans would be a little bit foolhardy to say that they would do better. I think a pivot to playing on her strengths and continuing the themes of the current Biden-Harris ticket, she may actually perform better than Republicans expect. So I think the reason Republicans want the Democrats to continue on is because better the devil they know than the unknown. And for Democrats, I would say it's better the devil you know than the unknown unknowns.
Judge Williams, there's been some pretty scathing criticism of President Biden from his own party, but that also raises some other questions. One of those basic questions is the question of democracy. I mean, 14 million people voted for Joe Biden to be their nominee. And then there's, of course, the political aspect of it, and that is things like the incumbency advantage.
Well, yeah, I mean, the aphorism is a circular firing squad always hits its target, right? And I think that's what's going on here. And I agree that there are tremendous unknowns, and I think Biden still has the strength to bring it across the finish line, even if there was kind of a weekend at Bernie's scenario where he's kind of propped up as the front runner of the ticket. But I think part of the problem here is that they're feeling a lack of energy. The donor class has spoken, even though the voters have spoken, and a lot of the incumbents in the House and the Senate have spoken. They've looked at their polls, they've heard from their donors, and they are hearing not good news. And so as a result, they're trying to make President Biden walk the plank, which is an unprecedented kind of thing in history. We've never been in this situation before. And I think it's looking past the fact that Donald Trump is, for all his strengths, he is still a quite weak candidate. His unpopularity ratings are slightly lower than Joe Biden's. His speech last night really wasn't a pivot towards unity. It was more the same, and it was so long and so rambling that even some Republican delegates walked out of the speech before the balloon dropped. So I think the Democrats have some very real advantages here, but it's hard to see after viewing Joe Biden's halting performance at the debate. I mean, it's got people hitting the panic button. I think perhaps a little too early, but in politics, it's a blink of an eye and a lifetime, a couple of months. So I think they're navigating uncharted waters. There's a very real danger that there's krakens below the surface and that it might not end up the way they think it will.
Brandon, what is your response to what Joseph just told us? Donald Trump is a relatively weak candidate, and he had that opportunity in his speech at the convention to focus on unity, to emphasize unity, but he didn't.
Was the speech long? Possibly. But I think the bigger issue is what the American people are saying is, Donald Trump has a felony, apparently. He's been called, there's been issues of Russian collusion. There's all these things that has been put up against this president, and yet he could possibly still win against a president who really hasn't had any issues. That tells you how bad the administration is on things like domestic policy, things like the fact that, the cost of milk is skyrocketing. To buy a home is skyrocketing. I think the problem is people are not looking at pocketbook issues, which I've always said all politics is local. And so the reality is, whether you like Joe Biden or not, business is business. And people are saying, hey, I can't afford childcare. I can't afford milk. I can't afford food. I can't afford a home or to purchase a home. And so what's happening, they're looking at the other option. But also, here's the thing about the issue. Anytime Nancy Pelosi is basically telling the president it's time to step down because of his age, Republicans said this a year ago. And the Democratic Party said, nope, that's not true. Joe Biden is strong as an ox. Well, guess what? If Joe Biden steps down because of it, again, Republicans look like the knight of shining armor. And so I think right now, what my colleague said earlier, even if Joe Biden wanted to leave, he can't leave.
Joel, there are Democrats, high-profile Democrats, who are deeply concerned about what is happening in the party right now. One of them is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, very well known, not just in the United States, but around the world. And she says that Democrats will be, in quoting her here, enormous peril if Biden is pushed aside. And she blames what's going on wealthy donors and distortions in social media. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on her argument about why it's happening, but I agree with her point, which is that if the Democratic Party pushes Joe Biden out unwillingly from this position, it will be a cataclysmic event, I believe, for the relationship between the party and the voters. The voters, as we've discussed, supported him in the primary process. He is a beloved politician in the party. And it's now gone through to the logical point where now we're heading into a convention. So he has to choose if he's going to, as Joseph said, walk the plank.
Yep.
He has to choose to do so willingly because otherwise we're going to have real splits. And I think for AOC, the Congresswoman, she's pointing out how this is a push against a lot of what would end up being the core voters. And let me remind just one more thing. Donors donate money in order to provide that to campaigns so they can communicate message to get people to vote. So you don't want to push away voters. You want to increase voters. And I think that's where Joe Biden, he understands this. He gets the stakes. He understands how the democratic process works better than any of us. He's been doing it for a longer time. And he gets that these voters are connected to him and that he's going to have to weather this storm. And that's why I think we're seeing him stand firm, even though a lot of the party backbone on the fundraising side is nervous.
Okay, that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.